afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. And welcome to our first Ask the Expert. And in this case, we're talking to Christine Miller, and she'll be talking about emergency management to resilience. Quick introduction for Christine. Christine has a lot of experience, many years of experience. Probably impolite to specify how many, but she's brings a wealth of experience both nationally within Australia and internationally. She's worked across risk, emergency, and business continuity management. And we were talking about Kristen and I have known each other for quite some time. And she's one of the rare people that brings experience across that whole spectrum of emergency management. So she's been in the planning space, she's been in the response space, she's been in the recovery space. She spent a lot of time doing emergency simulations and exercises to build capabilities and skills. And I'm hoping tonight that Christine will also be differentiating for us the difference between lessons learnt and lessons identified. It's a deep passion of mine, and I know Christine and I have spoken about it on a number of occasions. And if everyone will indulge me, and if you won't, I'm going to ask the question anyway. Chris, before you kick off with the 4 key points that you're going to address tonight, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey through emergency management, how you started in emergency, and how you've moved into broader organisational resilience. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Andrew and Maria, and thank you to all these generous people who've made time in their busy schedules to hop on tonight. Or it's night for me. It's possibly afternoon or evening, morning for some of you. Well, the idea of Ask the Expert came from some work I've been doing with the Global Supply Chain Council. They've been running Ask the Experts sessions, and I thought it might work well for the Institute of Strategic Risk Management as well. So that's why, not sort of my idea or a copied one. Well, you can do it, even if it does seem a bit overstating to refer to me as Ask the Expert. But as Andrew says, I've been at it a long time, and I was sort of born into it. My mother spent most weekends up in the mountains mountains. But we're talking Australia, so our mountains are hills to other people. But anyway, we call them mountains. Beautiful rainforest that she grew up in, and spent many weekends with Bernard O'Reilly's nephews. And for anyone that knows Australian history and emergency management, you'll know that name because Bernard saved people from a terrible plane crash, and it's become something of Australian folklore. And I've stood where Bernard allegedly saw a burnt tree in the far distance and went after that tree and found these people who would otherwise have certainly died without him. So that was that side of my family. And on the other side of my family, my father came from Tasmania, and his best friend set up what's called the North Alpine Association, which is effectively the rescue group for North Tasmania. Based around Launceston, where my father was born. And he and David were much involved in setting up ski rescues and mountain rescues and all sorts of things like that. And then he came to Queensland, courtesy the RAAF, and met my mother. And as I say, the rest is history. So I grew up with parents who loved the mountains, and it was sort of almost predestined. It was probably in my genes that I'd be an emergency manager. So then I joined the police, and before you know it, I was teaching search and rescue in the same mountains that I spent so much of my early life in as well. And that moved me into counter-terrorism, and then subsequently, so the people not from Australia, they're the biggest exercises we run in Australia. They're real time with the military, police, and other people involved, and it's quite an interesting experience standing across the table from the SAS, planning some of their exciting activities. And in those days, the SAS used to split forces and have some of their colleagues play the terrorist roles in those exercises, which you can imagine. They got up to a lot of mayhem and made it rather interesting for the people on the so-called white hat side while they were playing black hats and really enjoying it. I can assure you they did. More recently, I've been involved in major recovery activities such as the Bali bombings, the Indian Ocean tsunami, and so on, London bombings, and so it went. And then some offshore work courtesy of the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, working on mostly the health sector for World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, some in-house preparation in their business continuity space, working on an earthquake scenario, which was quite fascinating. And I used to spend, when I was president of the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services, used to spend a month in New Zealand with our members there, attending one of their excellent programs in emergency management training at Massey University. So, yes, I just keep bouncing about the place, following the opportunities where they arise. But you're right, Andrew, lessons management is one of my hobby horses. I got sick and tired in 54 years. Yes, I don't mind saying. Having been a police officer, I think it's miraculous I'm still alive, especially when I spent 7 years in highway patrol being tumbled around in police vehicles. It's really amazing. Anyway, in that time, I got sick and tired of the same old lessons not being learnt. So when I started to discover what the military had been up to, and if you look carefully at the history, it seems to date back as long ago as at least World War II, where the Americans were putting out what they call combat bulletins. And they were trying to avoid making the same mistakes over and over and over again in WW2. They got a bit more sophisticated by the Korean War, and in 1985 they actually set up a sort of academy called CALL to do better in this space. And then that sort of morphed into NATO, the UK, and Australian military and New Zealand military picked up the same ideas. They obviously have done some of those overseas postings and brought it back. And of course, the emergency managers went, hey, this looks good. We should pay more attention to this. And then it's gradually moved into business continuity. So the important distinction is lessons identified can come reasonably early in the process, but lessons learned take a lot longer. And I was proudly looking at a wonderful example of lessons learned from my time in Africa. There was a 90-minute call-out time for ambulances to the South African border from Mbabane, which is the capital of Eswatini, formerly the Kingdom of Swaziland. Now the Kingdom of Eswatini, as the king decided to change the name. But nonetheless, they still had this severe problem. A 90-minute call out for an ambulance, even under lights and siren, is way too long. And before I left my time in Eswatini, they took me to a 30-minute run business as usual, or 15 to 20 minutes under lights and sirens. So it's wonderful to see the ideas about lessons learned really being learned and the investment to make it so. Something from you in here. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction, very quick snapshot of where it all came from and some things you might like to raise. And the 4 items we have here, unless there's any questions, I'm happy to go on with those, Andrew.
I think if you just go on with those 4 points, Chris, and then we'll open the floor up.
Sure. So the 4 points that we were promising you, so to speak, emergency and disaster management, early operational years, well, I gave you a bit of that, and crisis centre activities. When I was positioned on a part-time basis, in those days it was part-time, in the Emergency Operations Centre for the Australian Government, they were they were not expecting any women. So they put the women's facilities on the fire escape. So you had to have a security pass if we had any women guests, which did cause some mirthful moments. I remember one legendary moment when we had a UK superintendent of police, a woman, come to visit with us and asked about where should she find the bathroom. And I said, I'll have to accompany you because the security pass. And she said, in a very plummy English accent, perhaps she had a public school background. Yes, Laurie's shaking his head. He's possibly met such a woman. And saying, well, I haven't been accompanied there since I was a toddler. And after a few sessions of this, the boys did ask me why it was we seemed to take a large amount of time there and usually returned laughing. They thought it might have been about them. But women in that space were, as Andrew's pointed out, quite a rarity, and the facilities never anticipated that there'd be a woman doing that kind of work. Fortunately, we've moved on from that, and a woman in that space is much less surprising. But there were more than a few mirthful moments, I'll grant you. Pandemic preparedness, yes, well, I did a lot of that for the World Bank, but I also did it for the Australian government before I started working with the World Bank on HEPA, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response. And many years before that, I worked on the Australian Health Management Plan Pandemic Influenza, which is called AMPI. And that sort of, and the exercises that we did, the large national exercises with Pumpston and Sustain 2008. And so the World Bank thought I might be useful to them. I was actually recommended by another colleague who'd been working with them. And we had been working on the AMPI together many years before. And of course, when COVID came along, we both said, along with some other colleagues involved in that writing package, geez, I hope we did a good job because our lives all depend on it now. And magically, when COVID came along, the AMPI got a new cover and a new name. And on the 18th of February 20, it magically appeared as the COVID response plan. And some of us recognised the older version that many had worked on to make that happen. And of course, we're preparing for the next pandemics, which might be H5N1 or some other thing. And we're overdue for another influenza pandemic, which seems to shock some people who think, oh, well, we've had COVID. Yes, yes. I said, yes, we're overdue for influenza. And there's almost, historically, since Roman times, been a cycle of about 100 years. And given the so-called Spanish flu was 1918-19, we are overdue. Enterprise risk management and business continuity. Oh, geez, you got the small topics there, Maria. You really wanted to test me out with some of the big ones. I've been working on a package of training for a UAE training provider, some online training in enterprise risk management. So that's a fascinating set of yes, indeed, Sherilyn, fascinating set of challenges, and one that too many businesses don't do as well as they might. Just recently, I was counter-pasting on LinkedIn about somebody talking about black swans, and I was stamping my little feet like a little grey rhino, courtesy of Marcel Walker's great book, saying, hang on here, a lot of these things, there were weak signals, or sometimes not so weak signals, that if you were looking for them in quality enterprise risk management, you would have picked it up. And recovery operations and case studies, well, goodness, which ones would you like to hear about? Too many stories, and we've only got an hour or 45 minutes at most left. But which one would you like to hear about?
Sorry,
Okay.
guys. Good morning, everybody from United Kingdom, London. What I'd be interested to hear is, and I'm talking about how we're getting funding. That's the commercial aspect of a crisis. So, we've recently conducted, and Fegan on the line should be pleased to hear this. We've recently conducted a multi-agency marauding terrorist attack exercise at one of our big estates in London. And the learnings that we got out of that was regards to resources. We have trauma medics there. We had the London Ambulance Service, representatives from the London Firearms, etc. And it did show that particular estate was understaffed. So I know we're talking about a smaller sort of incident, but I would be quite interested to understand how you take those learnings and how you convince others to actually pay into that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sure does. Well, often one needs to think about the investment in preparedness, but also just to take a couple of steps back too. When the COVID came along, we made some terrible tactical errors in Australia by not understanding cultural issues and quarantining some buildings in multi-story residential buildings in Melbourne. Andrew will be familiar with, and sending in meals that weren't halal and these kind of stupid things. So often it can be quite small things that seem small but are very important to the client group. And just thinking hard about those things, preferably in advance. I think one of the problems in emergency management where we're still quite underperforming, would be a fair statement. In Australia, it's argued that we spend over 90% of our emergency management budget on response. So it makes preparedness and recovery a sort of afterthought. And yet we know that recovery is a long tail. So if we could only invest in preparedness and having, not so long ago, stepped down as president of the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services, I can tell you that my members are rather sick and tired of being at the bottom of the cliff, and they'd like a lot more effort at the top of the cliff, a lot more preparedness, a lot more prevention, a lot more thinking through. And that's why some of this enterprise risk management is so important, to actually think through what truly are the hazards and what could be done to address those hazards before they manifest themselves as some sort of unpleasant, disastrous event that needs a whole lot of expensive response and provides a whole lot of suffering to the people directly involved.
Chris, I'll just go to a question from Ewan in the chat, and he asks, the challenges of learning lessons, can psychological profiling of key decision makers help, i.e. to identify those who are responsive to advice and third-party experiences and those who are not? Can you see that question, Chris, or do you want me to reread it?
It's okay, I've got it. Thank you, Ewan. You must have looked again at my resume and seen that my first degree was in industrial organisational psychology. But I don't think I've ever been able to practice it well enough for some of these characters I work for in leadership roles, particularly at senior levels. They have their own agenda, and you just do your best to try and influence them when you have an opportunity to do so. But some of them, no matter how reasonable your argument is or well-reasoned it might be, they're not buying it because it's not sort of politically acceptable to them at that time. But again, as I said to Johnny, it's hard sell, but we keep trying. And we keep trying to influence people, hopefully for the better, and with variable success.
Great. There's also a question there from Ingida, I think it is, who'd like to briefly note that donor communities and in many cases governments tend to be reluctant to adequately address community resilience. Response to that one, Chris?
Well, it was actually interesting. The HEPA money, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response under the World Bank, which was that grant-funded program, was Australian, German and Japanese government, actually did invest quite heavily in community engagement, various sort of outreach activities were very much a part of that grant program. So I wouldn't say it's universally successful, but it was nice to see some effort in that space in reaching out to communities that perhaps have been a bit under-addressed in the emergency space. And they were in that particular grant program. So maybe some of the real donors, like the World Bank is a major donor for Timor-Leste. It used to be the Australian government, but the World Bank's taken over that mantle. Some of those decision makers are beginning to realise that they need to invest in preparedness And that means not just your emergency services, but your community, so that the community is in a better state of greater capacity to look after themselves. But that often requires considerable education program. And people like Ian Fox and others have been talking about how do you educate the community to just for more self-care. And I noticed we got Cheryl in there, the New Zealanders. Oh, there's Ian popped up. The New Zealanders are actually very good at being honest, as I would put it, with their citizenry, that they won't get the help that they may have expected, and they do need to prepare themselves, and particularly, the Transalpine fault people that live along the alpine region of the southern island of New Zealand, where there's every expectation of a very significant earthquake, and that they may be without help for 30 days or more. And what are they going to do? How are they going to prepare themselves in advance? And I remember many years ago going to New Zealand, Sherilyn, and flipping over the Auckland when you still had a hard copy phone book, and on the back of that cover was a whole lot of very good emergency management advice, both to locals and visitors. And I went to Hawaii a few years subsequently and noticed that when you're on the big island of Hawaii, which is very prone to volcanic eruptions and potentially tsunami, that you switch on your TV in the motel and you get a few seconds of advice on emergency protection, where their evacuation centres are, what sort of signage to look for, and so on. So some countries are doing very well in that space, is building up that community education piece. I'm not to say that we're particularly leading in that in Australia, but we do it in our own way. Andrew will recall we've had some recent nasty bushfires in Victoria, and we're both here in Melbourne at present. Again, we seem pretty good at getting people out of harm's way, but not very good at preventing them being in harm's way in the first instance. So swings and roundabouts, but again, too much response, not enough preparedness.
Chris, there's a question here from Mike, and he says, my thoughts are that health doesn't invest enough in resources, funding, and people. Doesn't invest enough resources in preparedness and is focused more on response. And his question is, how do you change that narrative? And after you've asked that question, I'll go to Fegan's question.
Okay, thank you. Well, yes, indeed. When you work in the health sector, it is all about response and minimally in the preparedness phase. But again, to quote what happened with HEPA and what's been happening with the pandemic fund, there's money attached to those preparedness angles as well as response. And actually, in the HEPA funding, when you look at it very carefully, the breakdown, it's actually biased towards preparedness, training, community preparedness, community education, those kind of things, much more so than the response elements. So maybe the pendulum swinging just a little bit that way. But the data is quite compelling. Preparedness is a good investment, and the return is excellent compared to the high cost of response and recovery. So sometimes the dollars do talk. And for someone that's been engaged by a lot of people called chief financial officer, usually when they get adverse audit findings on their business continuity, you talk to them about return on investment and they immediately pay attention. So it depends on who your audience is, how you can get that across. So yes, the health sector is still agreed and self-evidently focused on response, but some parts of it and some funding is going the other way a little.
All right, so the question from Fegan is, with global instability, we are all finding ourselves in community resilience has become even more important than ever. Governments, local government, and communities need to catch up and prioritise community resilience, and emergency planning and preparedness should be high up on the agenda, never an afterthought, and material for more lessons to be learnt. Before you say anything, Chris, Fegan, for your knowledge, here in Australia, we have a federal government, a state government, and then we have local governments, because an extra layer of government is always helpful. And that causes a massive debate between who's in charge of what. So, and the state governments aren't required to comply with what the central government wants them to do. And sometimes the local governments are, and sometimes the local governments aren't. So that introduces a whole new level of fun. So Chris might want to comment on that as well.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. You're reminding me of when I worked on national crime prevention policy that magically became a national community safety policy, and it was launched by which one was it? So many prime ministers. Actually, it was launched by Howard. Come to think of it, I started working on it with Keating, and they're on different sides of the political spectrum. But it was very interesting there because we did have to engage with the three spheres. They don't like to be referred to as tiers of government. And the local government folks said, well, no, crime prevention, that's a state responsibility. It's not a Commonwealth responsibility, it's a state responsibility because they look after policing in Australia. So, but when we turned the discussion around to community safety, well, it was pretty hard for local government to say, oh, well, no, we're not interested in community safety. Of course they are. And often local government in Australia complains that they're very much the poor cousins. I remember some years ago, David Longy, one of your former prime ministers, Sherilyn, in New Zealand, said about somebody said to him about whether New Zealand should become a state of Australia, and he said, under whose constitution? Because New Zealand only has two spheres of government and we have to manage three. So for those of us who've worked in all spheres, it's an endless challenge to try and bring them together, get them onto the same page. They're not always naturally friendly groups. And in national crime prevention, community safety, we managed to bring 100 of them together at a major conference, which is the start of that national policy. And we were talking about awards earlier, Andrew. I got all these awards, which is very embarrassing. I've always seen myself as a behind the scenes fix-it person, not up front receiving awards. And often I've run away from people trying to give me awards. I remember going on holidays to avoid some awards on a few occasions. So my team got the award and I didn't have to be present. So yeah, there's some real, but coming back to the more important point is the tensions between those spheres of government and getting them aligned and working together in the best interest of the Australian or other communities can be a struggle because there's such endless tensions. For those less familiar with Australia, we have a constitution that's all about states' rights, not human rights. And we don't have a Bill of Rights because, heavens, historically when the Federation occurred in Australia, the states were the powerful ones and they wanted to keep the power and not give it to the federal government. So, and there's no mention of local government or the Prime Minister in the Constitution. Wonderful.
Chris, the next question's from Tom Rollinson, and he's made the comment, in industry, we formally appoint named people as control owners to ensure the preventative measures to avoid whatever the unwanted event are in place. Does this occur in government in your experience? And to your earlier point, it focuses on prevention rather than the response. Over to you, Chris.
Interesting idea. Controllers. Okay. Not familiar.
I think control owners. Control owners. That's
control owners.
Rather than a controller, formally appointing a control owner against the risk.
Oh, okay. Yes, well, we certainly do that. Particularly in the business continuity space. Who is the owner of this time critical business process that we're trying to save? But I've just recently started with another business, waste management, Cleanaway, and modern businesses are so interdependent. It becomes very difficult to actually identify who is the business owner of some of these most time-critical business processes because there's so much integration, both in terms of IT as well as actual business practices and inputs and outputs, both internally and externally, because we've outsourced so much of businesses now. It really makes it quite difficult to determine who is responsible for X, Y, or Z.
Right. David has asked me a question, but I think you'll have input on it as well. The Australian Emergency Management Institute at Mount Macedon was widely recognised as a global centre of excellence. It was closed in 2022 as part of the National Emergency Management Agency restructuring. Any lessons from that? So I used to spend a lot of time up at Mount Macedon, not only because they did an excellent roast on Wednesdays and great fish and chips on Fridays, but I was involved in
Yeah,
the development of a lot of doctrine there. That has now been passed to another agency, but we do not have this centre that people can come to, and that has caused ongoing problems. And I think probably in some ways has also led to a fracturing in the way the states and the federal government approaches things. I think probably the lesson identified, but not the lesson learnt from that, is when you have effective management systems, you should probably leave them in place. But Chris, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that.
yes. As David well knows, I've certainly bemoaned the loss of Mount Macedon, as we used to call it, which is now the Victorian property. Emergency Management Victoria is looking after it. The Commonwealth used to call it way back when counter disaster, and then it gradually moved forward to various iterations. And one of the things I always thought about Macedon was your point, Andrew, how it was a real opportunity of bringing people together. And it was interesting when I went to the FEMA Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, some years ago, that Hurricane Katrina was still very front and center of everyone's thinking. And it was interesting that there were so many difficulties in Louisiana, but Mississippi, which also was a nearby state and got hit hard with Katrina, had a history of sending their emergency managers to the FEMA Academy, whereas the Louisiana state government was less eager to invest in its emergency managers. And there was a bit of murmuring amongst the faculty about, I wonder if it made a difference with Katrina, having people who were better trained, better networked, and better prepared. It's hard to know, but I think it's a great loss to Australia, and one we continue, as you rightly pointed out, to suffer for the loss of it. And given it was only a few $100,000 involved in fixing up the residential wing of that college, uh, it seems like pretty false economy given the amount of disaster activities we've had to deal with, particularly in recent times. As I see you shaking your head, Andrew. And it just continues to grow. And as we both agreed, calling it climate change is fanciful. The climate has changed, and we should stop pretending otherwise. And we're certainly seeing it again and again this year with the huge fires in Victoria. And I noticed that there's an emergency alert in Western Australia where it's too late for people to leave their homes because the fire is upon them. So it's just become horrendous. Way back when I started in emergency management, there were distinct fire seasons or distinct disaster seasons. Used to be October to March, April. It's just fantasy land talking about that now. We've had so many winter fires, and most recently you see in LA with that dreadful fire in January, that's a winter fire. And the real world problems that that's causing us with things like aviation firefighting. We used to be able to borrow the Northern Hemisphere assets and cycle them through the Southern Hemisphere and send them back for their fire season. That's all gone.
Mm.
And all those wonderful evenings and sessions that we all spent at Macedon learning from each other and hopefully picking up some of those learnings and taking them back to our respective jurisdictions and making them more resilient because we were ahead of the curve in terms of learning from another incident that might be similar to one that could be an issue for our jurisdiction. All that's gone, and that's a rate loss and a false economy to shut down Macedon.
So our next question is from Ian, and then there's one from Felix, and then I think there's Elko after that, but I'll move to Ian first. How important do you think it is to recognise that human beings are conditioned to act by exception, by which I mean we only act and retain knowledge dependent on our proximity to danger, which means information, no matter how good it is irrelevant if we think it has no direct impact. Think air safety when travelling as a passenger. Over to you, Chris.
Well, I've done a lot of work in aviation, and I can tell you with great certainty they do their very best to genuinely learn the lessons. When I worked with air trans, call themselves ATSB, Australian Transport Safety Bureau, on their business continuity plan, there'd been a nasty air crash off Brazil, and it was an Airbus of a type that we flew a lot in Australia. They were very interested in learning what the hell happened to that Airbus in case we had to put out safety bulletins and make changes. So a lot of work I've done over the years has been involved with trying to learn lessons. I'm not sure we've always been successful. I remember reading Piper Alpha, King's Cross Station, all sorts of incident royal commissions and significant inquiries in the hope. I was tasked at one stage when I was Work Health and Safety Inspector in Queensland with looking at things like Piper Alpha, King's Cross Station, against our legislation and our codes of practice, to see if, and my tasking from the boss was, if this were to happen here, would our legislation and codes of practice, if implemented, have made a difference for the better or at least a similar outcome? And if it's worse, what amendments would you recommend to try and strengthen our position so that we didn't find ourselves in the same difficult situation? King's Cross Fire, wooden escalators, lots of rubbish accumulated underneath the escalators. And of course, in Australia, we generally have steel, metal escalators, and we actually have codes of practice that require rubbish collection from underneath the escalators. That was even before King's Cross Station, but that got strengthened because we realised that that was a potential hazard. So I spent a lot of time in the let's learn from everybody else, and also in the aviation sector. And I can assure you, I experienced it both with Air Services Australia and ATSB, the Air Crash Investigators. If anybody I've ever worked with has devoted vast sums of effort and energy and investment in learning lessons, it's those groups. So if you're a frequent flyer like David, I, and just about everyone else on this call that I recognise, be assured that these people invest a lot of time in trying to learn from each other and protect the flying public.
I think perhaps Ian may have been thinking about the lack of attention passengers pay to the safety brief. I think that's what I think when he said think air safety when travelling as a passenger, it was yes, nobody pays attention. They all doze. Recently on a flight, and they refused to take off because the people in the exit aisle had not been paying attention. They had to rebrief them.
All right.
They said we won't take you. You haven't been paying attention, so we're going to rebrief. Not people weren't very happy. But I will move to Felix now.
Well, hang on before you leave.
Sorry. Yep.
Talking about safety briefings, I remember flying from San Francisco to Sacramento, which is in Australia. It's much like flying between Sydney and Canberra. A lot of public servants on that flight, and it was a small aircraft, and all of a sudden the captain came out of the cockpit and started to do the safety demonstration And I noticed the usual, public servant way of tapping away on their laptops when they hop on the plane. All of a sudden they stopped and they put the biro in the rack. And I thought, hmm. So I paid more attention. I thought, this is very odd behaviour. I've seen nothing like this between Sydney and Canberra with lots of public servants. So between San Francisco and Sacramento. And then when the captain started explaining, well, if you haven't been in a car since the 1960s, you won't know how to put on the seatbelt. And this is a small aircraft, so we don't have life jackets on this aircraft. We got flotation cushions, and pulled one off the seat and gave a demo, and said, well, you better hope that we don't go into the Sacramento sewage treatment works, because that's on the flight path. It's landing this aircraft at Sacramento. It was just one, the poor fellow, if he gave up flying, he could always be in the comedy routine. And I noticed some airlines like Air New Zealand, we'll be talking to Laura tomorrow, have invested a whole lot of it in making their safety demonstrations more engaging. But way back when, I remember being part of a team that grizzled the airlines about their card. You pull it out of the front of back of your seat pocket thing. The old cards way back when, and when they're supposedly showing the passengers departing, the passengers weren't running. If you look at the new ones, the passenger looks like they're at least trying to make a quick escape. So yeah, there's a whole lot of science in that evacuation. And the A380s, for instance, for a long time they weren't authorised to fly because they couldn't get everyone off the aircraft in 10 minutes, which is the require for the fire safety requirements. So they had to look at where the positioning of the exits were. So it's a real science, that whole space. Yeah, it's not quite as uh, yes, the passengers don't always pay attention, but some airlines have invested a lot of effort to engage them more, and some of them have even had very entertaining pilots that manage to engage people who'd otherwise probably, who cares?
I'm going to go to, we've got three questions here, so we've still got quite a few minutes to answer them. The first one's from Felix, and then I'll go to LK. So from Felix, it's Chris, what is your advice if stakeholders like NGOs who want to invest or support government in emergency management, is it a good idea to welcome them on board for funding on training, or do government agencies stick to consultants for training and really looking at Africa for ways to achieve better collaboration?
Oh, that's a big question. I've worked with not-for-profits on their business continuity too. There's a whole range of ways of answering that question. In some Australian jurisdictions, the state disaster plans actually include not-for-profits as part of the response agencies. So that's one way of thinking of it. In Africa, I certainly saw a lot of evidence of not-for-profits, missionaries and other such people who've had a long history with some of these African countries. Variable in some places, that's true, but they continue to invest in healthcare, in all sorts of things to bring opportunity and security to those countries. It would be better if more of it was done internally by themselves, but many of those countries just don't have the tax base or the resources to do it themselves, and therefore rely on not-for-profits to help fill some of those gaps. And yeah, I'd much rather see the Africans looking after the Africans. But my experience of my time in Africa is, particularly in Eswatini, I met some truly brilliant people. There just wasn't enough of them. And you need a certain critical mass of people to really make a dent in some of these problems. And when you've got a country with 47% unemployment and still variable education, even though many of the leaders, they'd been to Harvard and and other great learning institutions and brought all that knowledge back to their country and worked incredibly hard to do the best for their people. Just not enough of them.
So I'll move to Elko, who asks, are there any formal mutual aid agreements in Australia within and between different states and within and between local government entities? If so, what were the downfalls and benefits when they were implemented in practice?
Another big question, Elko, goodness. Yes, there are formal agreements, definitely between jurisdictions. And this recent set of fires you've had in Victoria, you've been welcoming people from Canada, New Zealand, and other places to usually in the command and control and aviation tasking, because you tend to run out of those people fairly quickly. But also in real firefighters, some of them specialist firefighters. I remember we winched in some dry firefighter experts from North America when we had some Wallamai pines exposed to fire, or the potential of fire, and they're very historic, ancient trees. They've now got different measures to protect them, rather than relying on some very brave people to be winched in to do so. Their location is sort of something of a state secret. But we do have jurisdictional agreements that are not only within Australia but beyond. And we've gone to Canada and the United States and other people, New Zealand frequently to help one another. And of course, back to lessons, it provides lots of opportunities. So, for instance, one of the fires that Australians went to were peat fires in Canada, and then we had peat fires in northern Tasmania. And some of the learnings from how to manage those peat fires in Canada were helpful in the Australian context when we had similar soil conditions and similar fires here. So there is quite an advantage in this sort of jurisdictional sharing and bringing people from those jurisdictions to assist us. You never know, they might learn something too, and we've definitely learned something from going to their jurisdictions. There's lots of mutual aid agreements. For instance, Christchurch, after the bad earthquake there, we sent Sydney Water and all sorts of capability, because they still had the liquefaction problems post that nasty earthquake that kept clogging up their water, both the fresh and black water. So big history of mutual aid in Australia and beyond.
And Shanda has a question around BC. So there's a lot of there's a lot of theoretical guidance on business continuity standards, but far less practical direction on implementing a business continuity management system in a real organisation. From your experience, Chris, how can practitioners bridge this gap in practice? And second question, how should emergency response be effectively integrated into business continuity management systems rather than treated as a separate parallel discipline?
Yes, well, they're two big questions too. I remember when ISO 22301, which is the relevant standard for business continuity, first came out. It's a certifiable standard. Some of my colleagues said, oh, woe is us. They won't need us anymore because there's the standard. And I said, oh, rubbish. They'll need someone to interpret the standard. So there's still a real issue between, what's written in these documents like those standards, even the good practice guide from the BCI, Business Continuity Institute, and similar documents from DRRI, Disaster Recovery Institute. For those of you not familiar with business continuity, it's both of those, the BCI and DRRI, that accredit and certify business continuity managers across the world. And there is a real problem in turning those words of wisdom into useful realities for clients. But I do find too often that some of my colleagues seem to turn in business continuity into a brain surgery. It's it's a lot simpler than some of them are making out. And I often go into places and see my predecessor consultants coming in and go, why did they make it so hard? Um, Perhaps because I come from an emergency management background. Uh, 20 years ago, last November, I was given a 3-month posting by a Family and Community Services Deputy Secretary, Deputy CEO, to see if I could make the transition from emergency management to business continuity. Well, we know how that worked out. 20 years later, I'm still at it. Business continuity is very sticky. But I do encourage people to make it simpler rather than more complex. Because if the plans and procedures and what you're up to is too complicated, people won't do it. So you need to really ratchet back on some of the paperwork and focus on what people will do and give them checklists. I have a simple saying to many colleagues: you want the most expert people to write it for the least expert people to do it. And I'm very much a checklist person. So I tend to have like PPRR or 4Rs for you, Cheryl, and a very simple model where we look at what are you going to do to prepare? How are you going to respond in different timelines? You know, what are you going to do in the first 24 hours, first 7 days, and so on? And then how are you going to get back to business as usual, or more likely a new normal after some significant disruption? So I hope that gives you a few tips. And there was a second question, Andrew.
The second question, I've just got to go back up to it. The second question was in relation to, now I've lost the question. It was in relation to emergency response and how you better
Yes.
integrate that into business continuity rather than seeing it as a separate discipline.
Well, it isn't for me. I can't help myself. Too many years in emergency MBC, it just falls across. But I have got a nice simple model where I encourage people to think about it in these terms. First off, you're trying to save people, safety. So that's the emergency management element. But while that's happening, you'll be starting to switch on your business continuity, as in starting to save the business. So sometimes I actually run exercises such as the fire evacuation's underway, and I'll start messaging the ECO, the Emergency Coordination Team, Business Continuity, whatever they might call themselves, Crisis Management Team, Incident Management Team, while they're in the stairs going down the fire escapes. So I actually bring it together and quite actively talk about how you integrate them. But I also talk about handover. So when emergency management hands over to business continuity, so we factor that actually into the plans so that there is a clear handover if possible. It just depends on the nature of the incident, whether that is possible. But it helps. A simple model where look after your people, look after your business, but bring them into alignment as quickly as you possibly can.
Right, we're down to about 8. What are we down? We're down to 6 minutes, so we want to stick to time. But David has made a comment here that I'm sure you will appreciate the opportunity to comment on. In terms of lessons learned, the executive summary of every report on every incident are almost exactly the same. The events are unique, but the reasons for failure, organizational culture are almost exactly the same. So I think the question here is around what do we do in that space, because he points out the executive summary from I'm not going to spell this correctly, so I'll just talk about the Fukushima report after 2011, which perhaps encapsulates the problems associated with that. I think
Yeah,
we've
certainly
discussed this
does.
before with
And
David.
that is an excellent report. I'm not surprising that David should bring it to attention again. And that's been, as I say, a bit of a discussion point in LinkedIn over the last few days. Somebody put it up as a black swan event, and I went, no, no, we're talking Japan. They expect earthquakes. How the hell could you think that was a black swan? And when you look at the other plants, other than the Fukushima one that seemed to take a while to shut down, They shut down very quickly because if you know anything about the electrical network in Japan, the nuclear power stations are running their fast trains. So as soon as they shut down the nuclear power stations to protect them from that earthquake and the possible tsunami, and that took their trains offline real fast, or some of them, some of their fastest trains. So some of the companies, so I actually find it more interesting in that particular disaster to look at the other nuclear power plants and think about what they did differently, because Japan has a lot of them, or did have, and many of them have been mothballed since that earthquake and tsunami. So look at the others that survived or that managed to get through a disaster in better shape than the god awful mess at Fukushima that'll be an impost on generations to come. What can we learn from the people that maybe had the high reliability organisations, high reliability management? I think sometimes we tend to focus on the failures when we should actually be looking at the successes. And that might be where the real learning lies.
Chris, I think we've come to an end. There are no further questions. Chris, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us tonight, and it is wisdom. I truly appreciate the plan developed by the most expert for the least expert. Since having a discussion with you about business continuity, I've used that in my own organisation. It's been very well received. So thank you very much for your time tonight. I would also like to thank Maria for her time tonight and making sure that the technology worked. It makes the life of both the chair and the presenter so much easier when the technology works and you don't have to worry about pressing, or remember in my case to press the button. I think finally for Maria and David, perhaps you have your next ATE topic. Lessons is a big topic. It's a very interesting topic, and I think there's probably a lot of people that would enjoy the opportunity to have somebody speak about lessons as we move forward with that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance tonight. If we could all do a virtual or actual round of applause for Chris, that would be fantastic. And on that thought, I hope everybody has an enjoyable day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. For those of you that are heading off to bed, have a pleasant night's sleep. For those of you that are going to work for the rest of the day, I hope you enjoy that too. Thank you very much.